teacher that told me I never amount to nothing. To all the people that lived above the buildings that I was hustling for, they called the police on when I was trying to make some money to feed my daughter.
Theme song.
To all my peoples in the struggle, you know what I'm saying? It's all good, baby. It was all a dream.
I used to read Word Up magazine.
You know the words. I know that brings back memories, right? He dedicated a whole album to teachers that just didn't understand. Paul, go ahead and say your disclaimer for us.
You know, we didn't own the rights to that music, but we're going to jump right back in.
Absolutely. Welcome you to Vulnerable Voices. This is a podcast where we have real talk with real leaders and telling real stories. This season, Stay Woke Wednesdays, you have your two wonderful hosts, Dr. Paul Miller and myself, Dr. Erica Johnson. Yes. Excited to have you for Stay Woke Wednesdays. We have a special guest in the house. But before I allow him to introduce himself, I just want to start my intro with just a simple quote this week. I want to put something on your mind. There's a quote by an unknown author that says, "A miseducation is much more dangerous than no education. An uneducated person has common sense born of pattern recognition. A miseducated person has traded good sense for bad theories." And I just want you to allow that to marinate for a minute. Miseducation is worse than no education. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our special guest. If you would just introduce yourself and tell us who you are and what makes you fabulous on this Stay Woke Wednesday.
Oh, great. It's my pleasure to join both of you, Dr. Miller, of course, and nice to be introduced in that fashion. Dr. Erica Johnson, right? So my name is Corey Hepburn. I am a proud resident of Rochester, New York. I grew up in Rochester all my life. I am currently a vice principal at the Syracuse City School District, where, you know, we're continuing our diligent efforts to produce positive change. I'm also an advocate for social justice. I support causes that support the growth and development of communities and, of course, our nation. And I'm happy to be here.
All right, I see Mr. Hepburn. We go way back. Known Mr. Hepburn for a long time. Grew up with his older brother. I remember when he was a little snotty-nosed kid, the snot coming down his nose. He always had the little stash, though. He got that's his trademark stash going on. But it's good to see the brother doing big things, always working for his community. I seen his brother also fighting, on the front line when the Daniel Prude case was going on and some other issues. So, this brother is a good brother to have on here. We're going to have some interesting dialogue. And, I wanted to get you on because, I'm familiar with your story. I was around as you lived it. So, I wanted to get you on here to kind of talk about kind of where you've been to where you are currently. And, let's make some connections to what the education process looked like. And was there a miseducation, and what did that look like? And miseducation, everybody, doesn't have to mean the school system, even though it often is, but it also can mean the streets. What we're learning out there as Black men isn't always what it really is, and there's a lot of miseducation that goes on. I think it's something as simple as what I always find interesting is when you ask a young Black man, like who has his pants sagging, where did that come from, sir? And he says, well, that came from prison. And when you think about it, that didn't come from prison. That came from way back yonder. That came down the road some, where the master decided to break the buck. And so what's breaking the buck, you might ask? Breaking the buck is where the master decided to take the slave in front of people, publicly emasculate him, embarrass him, beat, and then sodomize him. And that sodomizing took place to break the buck. So they took the mind and they left the body. And so then they would make it so that that black man would have to keep his pants down around his behind to prove that he was broken and that he was their property. And so when we wear our pants like that, young men, you're representing something that has an age-old tradition of hurt and slavery, and there's a miseducation behind that. So miseducation could be a lot of things. So Mr. Hepburn, where let's jump right in, man. Let's talk. Keep it real. Tell people where you came from, some of the life you lived, and how you living now, man. What's going on?
Yeah, so this story, I'll save you the totality of it, but I do want to jump into some of the very important elements of it. And Dr. Miller, you mentioned some very important points, and you started with the reality that it did start way, way back, not just for me, but when we look at structural and systemic racism and racist ideas and how that plays out in the miseducation of a people. And you spoke directly and gave a pretty explicit example of how that reality continues to impact our community today. Even though it happened way long ago, there still is a system in place that is looking to control the mind and take over the body, or take over the mind and control the body. How that relates to me, as I grew up in a neighborhood like many of the young black men that we see today. And we talk about the differences, and I won't highlight that. I'll speak directly to how that neighborhood impacted some of the decisions that, I make and what we see being made today in this community. And I'll add, before even jumping into that, the reality that the work that we're doing now to support those same neighborhoods, as not only a business owner in Rochester and also a property owner. We're buying the same neighborhoods that we grew up in, where 10 young men on that street, out of 10 of us, 8 were either in prison or dead. And that is a reality, and the statistics speak to it. And ultimately, those statistics impacted my home and my life, losing my brother, who statistics said if you do not earn a high school graduation, you do not earn a high school diploma or a GED, by the time you are 30, you're likely going to be dead or in prison. At his 29th year, he didn't make it to 30. He made it to his 29th year. That story in itself is just an example of how statistics do weigh heavy in our community. However, on the other half of that, there are opportunities to change it, right? So growing up, and Dr. Miller, as you said, you've known me for quite some time, but growing up, I was in the streets. So we talk about people that grow up in a poverty-stricken neighborhood, and there's a difference between being a member of a poverty-stricken community and then actually being a member of the streets, right? So you have those individuals that, you go home and your parent says, I think you need to stay away from that one young man. Well, I was that young man, right? So Dr. Miller didn't listen either, even though he was a little older. We found ourselves somewhat in similar circles, and ultimately we are now in a similar circle doing some of the tremendous work that it's going to take to highlight the reality that regardless of statistics, there is still an opportunity for forward progress. There is still an opportunity to be a part of positive transformation. And of course, it is never too late to do the right thing.
So what was the shift for you, though? What was the shift? Like, where did you go from who you were to now, doing what you're doing and being part of a leadership team and running and operating a school?
Well, I'll tell you. So when I hear the term shift, I naturally think that, the idea that it occurs instantly, right? I think that ultimately I'm still making that shift. Right. The old ideas, the miseducation is something that I challenge daily. Right. So it's not a day that I don't wake up and I say that there are things that the neighborhoods I grew up in that I'm accustomed to. So there's a culture within society, right, that's connected to really the structural and systemic racism that supports the racist ideas, that creates a nurturing, fail-safe environment for non-Black children. And what I mean by that is failure is going to occur, right? It's going to happen in every element of the world that we see it. Unfortunately, for our Black youth and specifically Black men, when we fail, whether it be losing a sports event, losing at a sports game, or whether it be not getting the grade that we thought we earned and deserved, or whether it be some non-tangible experience, we're not nurtured in the way that non-Black youth are. And that ultimately can shape the way that we experience the world. And some really highlight the differences between, we talk about current times, medical support and treatment, right? And not to take us to a totally separate topic, but I think there's a connection there. If I go in the hospital and I'm experiencing some pain, the response ultimately, when related to a non-Black potential patient, is going to be that I am more capable of enduring that pain as opposed to a counterpart who receives some immediate service and attention and potentially some painkillers, right? So it's just not buying the idea that develops negative ideas also about our neighborhoods. And when we talk about miseducation and we talk about struggling schools and districts and we talk about neighborhoods that are not progressing, we ultimately, unfortunately, sometimes make a connection to areas and neighborhoods where people live that look like us. And unfortunately, that's connected to really miseducation, because the reality is that when we live in the city and we say that the city schools are bad, we are talking about ourselves. When we attend city schools and we say that city schools are bad, we are talking about ourselves. And it shows that we have adopted the racist ideas that have colorized locations. So I know I touched on a couple of elements, Dr. Miller, and I think your question kind of ignited a fire in me that is really tied to how miseducation leads to and supports structural and systemic racism, controlled all by ultimately racist ideas.
Corey, can we stay right there for just a moment? I've been in elementary, middle school leadership for years. It's my thing. I love the babies. But what I found to be most important is vocabulary, right? And so I think you hit on the importance of how we relate to things with the terms we use. So you talked about city schools, which really means our Black and brown schools, right? We talk about urban district. Well, really, you're talking about Black and brown kids, right? So I've had people that are not of color who struggle with that vocabulary and oftentimes are afraid to use the word urban or inner city because they truly understand that it is a microaggression and that it truly does mean, this Black or brown. So what would be your advice, your strategy to help us change the vernacular of how we talk about Black and brown children in education?
Well, I would start with saying being very intentional. And those colleagues or friends of yours that struggle with using any particular language, I think that is actually a strength, because they recognize that there is some implications or some cynicism or there is some negative connotations connected to their ideas related to a space, right? So unfortunately, we see time and time again that color and racist ideas is attached to geographic locations. And the reality that those who are non-Black individuals, that they actually think through this and they reflect through that process, and they're actually making connections to those biases, is something that is actually a strength. and it supports further conversation that says, why do you feel challenged by using the term urban? Or why do you feel a particular challenge related to, a city school? Because ultimately, unfortunately, there are some negative ideas connected to those spaces. And this is where we all refer right back to the reality that in miseducation, behaviors, locations, and experiences are colorized, right? We actually apply a color to an act, and we'll see it time and time again in mostly indirect conversations where you would hear one individual say, I'm moving into a neighborhood and I'm going to have to get a fence and probably a big dog. And automatically there's some thoughts there connected to that space. And even though that person has not shared specifically where they're moving, what location they're in, they've shared some ideas about that space that unfortunately we have connected to a people or a particular experience. And ultimately, it's usually connected to systemic or structural racism or racist ideas and implicit biases.
Which is a huge piece. Go ahead, Paul.
No, it's interesting because I think about the old saying, if you knew better, you do better. And I go back to your quote. And your quote, you were saying that basically if you knew better, you do better. And how can we as a people continue to keep living and making the same mistakes? And I think we can blame a lot of people, but we got to start turning our excuses into our reasons, right? So Corey turned his excuses into his reasons, and his reasons have now pushed him forward to a platform where he can live his dreams, where he can do what he wants to do and affect change. And so we got to be a part of this solution. So I think, how do we get people to realize and encourage? Because you hear so many of the excuses consistently. You hear people who, and don't get me wrong, there's terrible injustices out there, the miseducation of what's happening. We can go back historically and think about I think we got voting coming up, right? And so I had a conversation today, and y'all tell me what y'all think. And Erica, you're in the South, so you might be able to talk a little bit about this. So I have two young ladies who do curriculum for me, and they are both from the South. They're from the Tennessee area, right? And so the one young lady stepped up and said, do we need to do something special for voting next week? Like, do we have to change our schedule or do something? And I looked at her like, why would we do that? Like, no, people will vote before work or after work. It is what it is. She was like, huh? She was like, because in the South, they close all the polls where in urban areas or in Black areas, let's say Black and brown areas. And so there's only one, maybe two polls. So everybody's waiting in line all day to deter people from voting. Do you experience, does that happen in the Texas area too? And what does it look like? Because there's some miseducation there and there. Because I'm taking it for granted because I'm about to walk in the poll. I might have to wait 5 or 10 minutes, and that's it. But I don't have to wait around the corner in the heat.
Voter suppression is real. The Voting Rights Act has practically been dissolved with some really important pieces that were there that now have went back to the state. And so the state is able to make their own decisions on when to open the polls for early voting, how many polling locations that they'll have in certain counties. And it is true voter suppression, because what you do have, I was watching a Twitter post by Roland Martin, and that's where we met, Paul, on the Roland Martin show. And, right. I was watching his Twitter post, and he is literally in tears as he's filming the line for voting at one of the mega churches, Friendship West here in Dallas. And so it just really brought tears to his eyes because, you know, people were in line for hours and hours and hours. Here in the South, we talk about, and I talked about this, I think, on our first episode this season, pack a lunch. Plan your voting out. I mean, it's that serious because you will have to stand in line. Several people I've talked to, I was a lucky one, too long, but when I was coming out, the line was, you know, down the steps and starting to curve around the corner. So it is real. We don't have as many polls available as we should. And you wonder why. A neat thing that Houston Independent School District has done is they're closing school on voting day so that people will have no excuse to go vote. So yeah, here in the South is a huge thing. And you know, we're struggling to really truly have our right to express our voice, which is why it's so crucial that we vote, because our lives really do depend on it.
But see, then the miseducation is also, we're going to have folks that don't realize this, don't realize the importance, and don't realize that people died for our right to be able to vote. And the miseducation comes in when they say, yo, I'm not voting. You know, I don't like either candidate, you know, but a non-vote is a vote for the person who's in office, basically.
Absolutely.
You know, and so, you know, if that's where your allegiance lies, you know, so be it. But at the end of the day, I think based off of the gentleman's track record, he's not showing that he has any interest in helping anyone who does not look like him and has billions of dollars.
Right.
So, you know, and not to say the other candidate is magnificent or that I'm in love with his politics, because he's, you know, he was big on the crime bill and everything, and you know, he switched it up. But at the end of the day, you know, the lesser of two evils in my personal perspective. But going into the miseducation comes in when you decide not to vote, when you don't exercise that right, even whether you like the candidates or not, and not understanding that the voter suppression is still real, not understanding that redlining, like you think about redlining. And for those of you who don't know what redlining is where entities wouldn't lend money to Black and brown people and to live in certain areas. So they made it so that you could only live in certain areas. But you look at our neighborhoods are concentrated. But that all comes for a reason, because they want to pour poverty on top of each other. So at the end of the day, what happened is that you have two families, even if you're two middle-class families, you couldn't live in the same area, and your child would have to go to a school that wasn't serviced the same way because they don't have the same tax bracket. And when we all know that a lot of the revenue for traditional public schools do come from tax revenue. So and then the child has a hard time getting into the college that they want to get into because they didn't go to the high school that they should have went to. And so it keeps going and going and going. But these are all these cycles that keep repeating themselves and that we have today. And so, you know, how do you see that, Corey, in where you're at? How do you see some of these injustices play out within the, and, you know, I'm not trying to get you to put your current employer, put your previous employer on blast. I don't care. I'm gonna speak my mind. So say what you got to say, brother. But how do you see it following out on where you've been employed? If you don't want to talk about now, talk about before. No,
so I'll emphasize this, and I tell any employing establishment that I don't do this work because I need a job. You know, of course, you want to be realistic and you want to be diplomatic and do what you do with dignity. But ultimately, that's why you want to, in the sense of business, have multiple streams of income. I do this work because of my commitment. And you talked about a pivot. And I think this connects to your question too, Dr. Miller, being able to make a pivot from prior experience, prior decisions, and how that miseducation within that impacted your life is going to be the results in getting the right people in places to give voters better options. A part of feeling that you don't have options when voting is connected to hopelessness. And if you can keep a community to feel hopeless, you can keep them inactive, and you can keep them making decisions connected to miseducation. I see miseducation play out in multiple ways. I see it play out in the sense related to, of course, bias and fragility, right? People want to protect ideas. And even Dr. Miller, when you mentioned to me, you're like, man, you know, being a Black male, you understand that there's challenges related to using your voice. And you knew automatically that there can be some type of repercussion. And then even my response in saying you have to be politically correct ultimately, right? And you have to do what you do with dignity. And
I ain't with all that. That's why I ain't got a job in your hometown now, because I'm not politically correct. They don't mess with me, bro.
Yes.
But it's all good.
That's because Paul, you're the boss right now. See, that's a different stroke of power. We'll have that conversation a little later.
Yes, but he's speaking to it, and there has to be a sense of fearlessness, right, Dr. Johnson, where you have your non-negotiables, and I think you speak to that when you say, "I'm grateful to do this work. I'm grateful to have an opportunity here, but ultimately, I am my own boss, right? And you're the boss of yourself. You realize that you're able to make pivots when you come from the streets. You know, you have an edge. It is not something that is really a handicap. It is something that puts you in the space that says, I've been through things that the people around me haven't. So when you use those microaggressions, I've had macroaggressions against me. You know, what you're doing is not going to hurt me in a sense. I can use it. And in some cases, it creates a challenge that is almost laughable. Because when you can apply your street smarts in a room full of individuals that don't necessarily have that skill, they have the wit, they have the intellect, they have the book smarts, they have the root memory smarts, they can remember a text and quote different chapters, but when they can't reply to something with the high social emotional intelligence, when you can look at a person and tell their intent, is something that is really a defense mechanism. It is something that helps us survive. And I say us because even Dr. Miller, knowing you for years, but even just meeting you, Dr. Johnson, I can see that you have that same relative skill set. And that's something that we can apply in any scenario. And that is what's going to make the difference when we apply it in a united way and in a way that removes hopelessness and shows individuals that have had failures, as we mentioned in the first part of this conversation, that a failure is not something that stops you and hinders you from success. It is ultimately an opportunity. Challenges are not obstacles. They're opportunities to do things differently, and they're opportunities to reach your goal in a unique way. And I think that that is what makes the difference. And I'll speak directly to a couple of examples that I saw. Currently, I'm in Syracuse at the school district and even in Rochester. And those examples really speak to the reality that as a people who move forward, and I'll use the term people of color, when we get into spaces, and Dr. Miller speaks very proudly in the reality that it's okay. I don't care if my seat's on fire. I'm going to stand up, I'm going to put the fire out, and I'm going to sit back down. Our leaders that look like us, their seats are on fire. And unfortunately, they do not always surround themselves with the proper advisors. They don't do it sometimes because of the fear that it will appear that they are intentionally recruiting people that have particular skills and that look a certain way. And when you do that, yeah, you should be, right? But what happens is you say, oh man, if I hire this person, then people are going to think I'm just hiring people that look like me. Mm-hmm. Oh, when the reality is it happens in the business world, the educational world, the academic world, whether it's intentional or unconscious, people are more prone to see the skills that they desire in people that look like them. And ultimately, you want to be intentional about forward progress and diversity and inclusion. And I'll end with the reality that I highlight inclusion because diversity is just putting another face. Inclusion is when that face voices matter at the table.
Absolutely. It's about that voice, you know, something and having an impact to reach back, pull somebody else up. I thought it was really interesting, you know, Dr. Miller, you were talking about, you know, that you're going to use your voice basically. And it doesn't matter because you stand firm on what you believe in. And so I made the point that, yeah, well, Paul, you're the boss, right? You're running it. And I think that's you. And I think that's huge because we need more people that look like us that are running it. People that look like us that are making decisions for children who look like us. To your point, Corey, you know, the world that people of color live in, you have to navigate your, like you referred to, your street life. And then, you know, there's a whole different America to us. And when you're able to really embrace all components of your culture, those are the people that we need sitting in the big seats like Dr. Miller. And so for what you do and standing firm on what you believe in, we need more Dr. Millers.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And I'll say this, Dr. Miller, one of the challenges for individuals that come with a little more edge. I use that terms very specifically and intentionally because that's what you hear sometimes in the back rooms after interviews. Oh, well, that candidate, you know, they were a little edgy. They weren't as polished as this candidate, or, you know, these are the excuses.
It's a bit aggressive.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He's a bit aggressive. Well, really, that's just, you know, your natural. Or did you see how he was glaring at me? Or her tone was not well received by the team. But these are really coded conversations, right? The same ones that are coded when we talk about a specific location that's been colorized and sometimes behaviors that have been criminalized. But really, those behaviors are across cultures. They are across genders. They are across ethical ethnicities. So if you look at that coded conversation and think back to conversations you've been included in, and they're like, oh, well, just a little edgy, something about that person just didn't sit right with me, right? And these are the moments where, you know, we can highlight the skills that our organizations needs, regardless of the company. I know we're speaking to the importance of inclusivity and diversity, but ultimately, I think that a solution to one of the challenges is we use our voice in those spaces when we notice and recognize, and we don't always see them, what can be viewed as microaggressions and what can be viewed as implicit bias connected to a particular candidate just because they have what I would call some street appeal, something that works very good in education, believe me, because they can connect with the students. But just wanted to add that.
Now, you know, we're getting near time. And so, you know, we're gonna try to close out this very rich dialogue. And, you know, Wayne did have a question. Wayne is on Get Vocal site. Actually, go follow Wayne at Stage Charm on Instagram. He's going to be talking about all this in a comedic form. So a little plug for Wayne there. But he asked a question. He says, what do you say to those who feel like they don't have a voice? And my thing is that you only, sometimes you're in a situation where you feel like that, but you only don't have a voice if you choose not to use it. And so, if you're worried about the outcomes, but there's always ways to find a way to use your voice and to speak. And it's about that confidence, and it's about also living in faith. So, you know, and believing that God's not going to put you in a situation that you can't handle, and speaking your truths. Speak your truths, speak it loud, speak it proud, but do it with tact, do it with respect, but find a way to articulate it in a way that people can hear you. And so when I say all that, that leads me to closing and thinking about, you know, we have too much learned helplessness in our community. So the learned helplessness is feeling like something's going to be done to you, or it's going to happen no matter what you do. And no matter what you do, you can't get over that learned helplessness. And so some of this miseducation, it comes because we've learned how to be helpless. And so we have to reverse that curse, and we have to reverse that helplessness by reframing our thoughts, by forming new habits, new rituals, new routines, and by working towards overcoming it. So doing things like Corey has expressed about being a business owner, being a property owner, putting yourself out there, you know, going to get a higher level of education. Like I can only tell you from example that I never thought I was the smartest person in the room. I still don't think. I think both of these two people are probably a lot smarter than me. But what I will tell you is that y'all can't outwork me. I will tell you that on any given day, I don't care who you put in the room, and there's not going to be anybody that I feel can outwork me. And so when I feel like that, you know, that's where my strength lies. So I might not be that smartest person, but I'm going to find my strength and I'm going to go towards that. And I'm going to find a way not to be helpless. I remember going through my doctorate degree, and the first day I went into the room, there was maybe 20, 22 people within the cohort. There was maybe about 18 white folks and maybe 4 black folks, right? And so I get into the room, and when I get into the room, I felt like, damn, I'm not good enough. I'm here with all these people who have fancy titles already. They have all these jobs, and I wasn't doing bad. I was assistant principal at the same time that I was talking about in reference to this. But they had all these fancy titles, the assistant superintendents, heads of companies, hospitals, and all these other things. And I'm like, and they start talking the language and start reciting quotes and other things like that. I'm like, yo, am I in the right spot? And it took me months. It took me over a year to realize that I was in the right spot, doing the right thing, and I could have gave up. And there were even people that I worked with that told me that I wasn't really good enough to be doing what I had to do there. And that was a miseducation. And so I could have gave into that, and I could have been helpless, and I could have gave way to that. But I decided to live in my purpose, and my purpose was to push further so I can open doors for myself and for others. And so that purpose and that why, I had to figure out what it was, but I also had to figure out that I was more than good enough and that I had the ability to do it. I had to overcome those hurdles. And actually, by the end of the course, I started to see that all those people that were talking, they had the same indiscretions that I had. They just knew how to cover it up and how to code it different. And so I had to learn how to code it, and I had to learn how to fight through it. And by doing that, I ended up winning dissertation of the year. I ended up winning, you know, where these folks didn't even probably think I was going to graduate at first. And so not that I'm all that great or that anything that special, but it's not about how smart you are, it's how hard you're willing to work. And so that miseducation, we need to turn that excuse into our reason, people, and get over that helplessness and become the people that we're meant to be. So that's my closing thoughts for tonight. I want to thank Mr. Hepburn Corey Hepburn for joining us. I want to thank Dr. Johnson Allen, Erica Johnson Allen, the Dr. Erica Johnson Allen, as always, for being the lovely co-host that she is. Also, next week, we're going to be talking about, I believe, Generation X versus Generation Z.
We are, and one of our special guests is watching tonight, so I think she's getting ready.
Yeah, get ready. Bring it on. So we got some good guests. We're going to talk about the mindset of the different generations, and we're going to talk about, you know, because my argument now is that, you know, this new generation is the weakest generation I've ever seen. So we're going to talk about that, and go like and subscribe at Vulnerable Voices. You can watch us live on Facebook, on Twitter. Thank you all for the support, and we'll see you next week, same time, same place, 7:30. All right, thank you for joining us.
All right, it's been real. Peace.